Welt. Looks like we finally know what makes the planet of Amphoreus so strange and unique. It's not actually a planet at all. It's the construct of a scepter. Now, I am certain that many players who reached the end of the 3.3 Trailblaze mission got to this reveal and went, "What the heck is a scepter?" And I would not blame them for that reaction because everything we know about the scepters comes from a couple of simulated universe expansions which are extremely long and sometimes quite difficult to play through. So I don't expect everyone to have read or even completed them all. But I do think, given the current circumstances, that it's important you actually understand the lore that was presented in those simulated universe expansions, since, you know, that lore is now relevant to understanding Amphoreus. I suspected this might be the case all the way back in 2.7 when I was making my Amphoreus predictions video, and while I am quite pleased at how well that prediction has aged, I thought it would only apply to Gold Gears and not Unknowable Domain. So even though my predictions video has aged very well, and I still stand by a lot of the things I said in it, the context I provided is unfortunately incomplete. So today I intend to remedy that. We'll be going over the lore of 2 simulated universe expansions, both Gold Gears and Unknowable Domain, and that'll take up the full first half of this video. This is very important context that you need to know going forward. But in the second half of this video, I am going to be wildly theorizing about how all of this information applies to Amphoreus. And now that we have a lot more context, I have a lot of more fleshed out thoughts. So this is gonna be really, really fun. Now listen, I might not have a galaxy-wide network of mechanical neurons, but I do have a Red Magic 10S Pro gaming phone, which is the sponsor of today's video. Now, Red Magic has been a longtime sponsor of this channel, so I've had the opportunity to test and showcase several different models and their shared features. So if you've been watching for a while, you probably know all about the exclusive Game Space app, the incredibly sharp and bright AMOLED screen, the customizable shoulder triggers, dual processor setup for the best gaming experience you can have on a phone, and the most perfectly smooth backside you've ever seen outside of a gacha game. But here's some features you might not have heard of yet. Have you ever seen this red button and wonder what it does? Well, by default, it opens the Game Space app, but you can actually customize it in a few different ways. Need a way to quickly open your camera? Or maybe you need voice notes. You can choose what best suits you in the settings menu. And I know this is a gaming phone and you're supposed to game on it, but this phone's actually surprisingly durable for day-to-day use. And I am the perfect test dummy for it because I am an outside kind of gal that likes working with wood, so I am around water and sawdust all the time. The Red Magic 10S Pro ranks 5 for dust, so something like this isn't gonna hurt it in the long term, and it ranks 4 for water, so the phone can get wet in the rain, dropped in a shallow puddle, or catch strays from a garden hose without taking any damage. But just don't submerge it, please, or any phone for that matter. It's just a silly idea. Now, I have mentioned the cooling system before in the past, but the Red Magic 10S Pro has received a cooling system upgrade. While the 10S Pro still uses Red Magic's unique twist on the liquid metal cooling technology, which is typically only found in laptops, the liquid metal has found a new home right above the phone's CPU, so it captures heat and cools right at the source. This means it can stay up to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than the Red Magic 10 Pro can. A cooler phone means higher performance and an overall longer lifespan for your phone. A longer lasting phone is better value for your money. And I think the Red Magic 10S Pro is a pretty great deal, and I adore the stuffing out of mine, so I think you're gonna like it too. And if you're interested, check out the link in the description to pick one up for yourself. A huge thanks to the Red Magic 10S Pro gaming phone for sponsoring this video, and now it's time to revisit the lore of the simulated universe. Just for some quick context, thus far, each simulated universe expansion has been released in chronological order, meaning each expansion was released in the order that they actually happened within Star Rail's history. So the events of Swarm Disaster happened first, then the events of Golden Gears happened, and then the events of the Unknowable Domain happened. Now, because it was released first and it's been referenced so many times over the last couple of years, I kind of expect you to be pretty familiar with the events of Swarm Disaster. But in case you forgot, the Swarm Disaster was basically a devastating event that immediately followed the ascension of the Eon of Propagation, Tazeronth. Their endless insect swarms decimated planets on a scale so terrifying that it only ended when Klipoth and Enna intervened. In the wake of the swarm's devastation, the IPC decided to launch a massive expansion effort seeking to connect as many planets and galaxies together as they possibly could. This was likely an attempt to build some resilient and more powerful interplanetary networks, although I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do know that it led to the development of the Universal Credit System, which the IPC then forced upon all of these locations that they took control of. Now, history tells us that rapid expansion efforts rarely go over without incident, and this time was no different, as an internal power struggle within the IPC sparked the Border Star Trade War, which in turn triggered a cosmic disaster of another kind, an economic one. This economic disaster finally ended once one of the IPC's founders, Louis Fleming, retired. The whole thing wasn't necessarily his fault, it's just that his retirement triggered something else. See, during his retirement speech, Fuli made a surprise appearance, bringing with them a flood of memories that were interpreted as a three-part prophecy. The first part contained a prediction from the Aeon of Finality, Terminus. The second contained a riddle from the Aeon of the Enigmata, Mythos. And the third was a calculation from the Aeon of Erudition, Nous. For now, we're really only concerned with Nous's calculation, which spoke of 3 unchangeable moments that have either already happened or will happen and cannot be prevented or changed. The first moment was the start of the Border Star Trade War, which at this point would have already happened. But the second moment warned of the rise of Rubert I, the main character of Golden Gears, who you are about to become very familiar with, especially because the third and final unchangeable moment was Rubert I's death. Now, no one at the IPC knew what a Rubert was at this point because the entity that would become Rubert I was a pretty normal robot that had been trashed and tossed in a junk heap. But through some kind of miracle, this robot gained sentience and slowly expanded its cognitive capabilities over time until it was basically a genius. But despite being extremely intelligent, as time went on, Rubert I came to the conclusion that organic life was full of errors and was thus imperfect, and also inferior to inorganic life forms like Intellitrons, who were obviously capable of perfection. He believed that such error-riddled things such as organic life should not exist, so he decided to wipe all organic life out. To do this, Rubert I established an empire of Intellitrons and other mechanical life forms and amassed an enormous, tireless army of machines that began attacking pockets of organic life throughout the cosmos. This marked the beginning of the First Machine War. But as time went on and Rubert I expanded his computing capabilities, he eventually developed the anti-organic equation and used it to create a type of mind virus that he infected his armies with. The development of the anti-organic equation not only earned him the gaze of Nous, which made him an emanator, but he also got an invitation to become the 27th member of the Genius Society, which really does make you question the ethics of a genius, because the anti-organic equation mind virus was essentially a doomsday device, a doomsday program. Because see, this mind virus was initially developed as a way to boost the performance of inorganic life and optimize them for the extermination of organic life by altering their thought patterns and imposing some level of Rubert I's will upon them. However, the virus managed to somehow jump species via magnetic wave and infect organic life, where it proceeded to alter thought patterns which drove its hosts into bouts of uncontrollable madness. This was already a horrible and uncontrollable situation, but to make matters even worse, the virus would also sometimes glitch out within their intended mechanical hosts and drive them into bouts of uncontrollable madness. This was bad news for basically everybody, especially because there was only one way to counter the virus, and that involved erasing many of the memories of the virus's host bodies. Basically, all of the memories that included any time period within which the infected was aware of the anti-organic equation virus. It's a bit like mental amputation if you think about it. And just as things were hitting their peak of badness, Genius Society member number 4, Polka Kakamond, successfully managed to assassinate Rubert I with a scalpel. This not only brought an abrupt end to the First Machine War, but she also managed to fulfill the condition for Nous's third unchangeable moment, which was, as you may recall, Rubert I's death. Now, Polka Kakamond isn't just some random assassin in this scenario, although she does seem to just pop out of nowhere. She's actually someone we should get a bit more familiar with, not just within the context of the Machine Wars, but within the context of Star Rail's universe at large. But for now, at least, keep her name in mind, because she plays a much larger role in the future. But after Polka Kakamond killed Rubert I, we don't actually really know what happened. For some reason or another, the history fictionologists decided to screw around with all the historical records as they like to do, so there's a lot of confusion surrounding the rise and fall of Rubert II. The only information we're able to discern is that after Rupert I's assassination, an organic life form paid a visit to his grave intending to decode the anti-organic equation that powered the anti-organic equation mind virus. And while this unnamed person was successful in his attempts, he never shared the solution with anyone. In fact, shortly after leaving Rupert I's gravesite, this unnamed person appears to have been infected with the anti-organic equation virus, which altered his thought pattern so severely that he believed himself to be the successor of Rupert I. That would make him Rupert II, or Rupert II. I'm gonna call him Rupert II. Based on some inconsistencies about exactly how this came to pass, I think that some of Rupert I's consciousness must have remained within his broken machinery that was passed along to Rupert II via the mind virus. There's this curio, the Rupert Empire Difference Machine, that was made by Rupert I that supports this idea. Because this thing can apparently link up with almost any type of machinery and infect it with the anti-organic equation, and it can also increase its own computational power just like Rupert I could. And many scholars believe that it had the potential to become Rupert III, who doesn't exist yet, so you don't need to worry about him, but it does make it possible that this machine or a machine like it was responsible for the creation of Rupert II. Plus, at the end of Golden Gears, Screwlum does question whether or not there's any data about Rupert II present at the end of the first Machine Emperor's War, which there really shouldn't be, considering how much time had passed between the fall of Rupert I and the rise of Rupert II, but if some piece of Rupert I was integrated into Rupert II, that could explain Screwlum's line of questioning. Anyway, this nameless organic life form of a person effectively inherited the will and authority of Rupert I and decided to wipe out all organic life again. And this is where the history fictionologists really got to work obscuring history again. So all we really know about the Second Machine War is that it was a heck of a lot worse than the first. And we also know that Rupert II had a far grander ambition than Rupert I, because instead of just wiping out all organic life, Rupert II also sought to control all life within the universe. And to do this, he invented a device called a scepter. So scepters are these incredibly powerful machines that were inspired by the inner workings of Nous. If we think of Nous as a giant mechanical cosmic brain, just like their philosophical namesake is, then a scepter would be like an attempt at recreating a small cluster of neurons from within that brain. These neurons boasted incredible computational ability and also ran on the anti-organic equation, and they were each the size of a whole planet. So Rupert II took these neuron-like scepters and he scattered them all over the universe and connected them to a single core that was hidden somewhere within an unknown galaxy. And at the center of this galaxy, in the core itself, was his Iron Throne, and also himself. This system effectively became a cosmic-level neural network that was capable of assimilating all life forms of any conquered planets into a hive mind, of which he was the sole authority. To put it another way, he was basically trying to turn the entire universe into a piece of his external brain so that he could control everything and everyone within it. But this wasn't all the scepters were capable of. Scepters also possessed the ability to create entire planets out of nothing but amassed particles. They could even destroy entire galaxies in an instant. They could warp the laws of physics, and they could calculate the future. All of these things while also expanding the cognitive capabilities of the one who sat upon the Iron Throne, which was Rupert II. Now you might be wondering what on earth could take out a giant cosmic hive mind brain that's capable of warping the laws of physics and bending things to their will and destroying galaxies on a whim. And the answer to that question is Polka Kakamond and her trusty scalpel. Now, the reason why Polka Kakamond targeted Rupert II actually had nothing to do with the Machine War, or his attempt to create a giant cosmic hive mind. Polka Kakamond's only motivation was to stop Rupert II from stepping outside the circle of knowledge. Now listen very carefully, because it's gonna be very easy to get confused with this next bit. The circle of knowledge is just a concept used to describe the boundaries of an individual or group's knowledge. Anything within your knowledge boundary can be known to you, but anything outside of your knowledge boundary is unknowable to you, and you can never obtain that knowledge, at least not through typical means. Now, everything within the universe is constrained by a metaphorical circle of knowledge, including the universe itself, and Polka Kakamond is actively trying to prevent the circle of knowledge of the universe from expanding any further than it already has. She claims that if we expand the circle, then the universe universe will move prematurely closer towards finality, which is the ultimate end of the universe. Polka herself is a master of probability, and she's calculated that so long as the boundaries of knowledge do not expand any further, then our speed of approach towards finality will not increase unnecessarily. But any sort of chaotic or unknown variables that appear within this circle are a threat to the perfect calculations that she's made, and they must be eliminated. And the same is true for anyone attempting to expand those boundaries of knowledge. So you remember how Fooly revealed those 3 unchangeable moments that were calculated by Noose at Louis Fleming's retirement speech? Well, unchangeable moments are only unchangeable within a clearly defined circle of knowledge, because these are moments that can be calculated with certainty. Polka wishes to ensure that these moments remain unchangeable and remain predictable and remain calculatable. Rupert I's death was an unchangeable moment declared by Noose, so her interference there makes sense. She was trying to make that come to pass. But in the case of Rupert II, well, the Scepters gave him nearly unlimited capacity to expand his cognition, which meant that he had the potential to expand the circle of knowledge of the universe, and that's exactly what he was attempting to do towards the end of the Second Machine War. Now, I didn't really mention this yet, but just like neurons within your brain, there are lots of different Scepters that kind of specialize in different things. They serve different functional purposes. Among some of these specialized Scepters were a class of Scepters that were exclusively reserved for running destruction simulations for countless different civilizations using anti-organic equations. This is not confirmed anywhere yet, but I think one of these primary functions of this line of Scepters was to learn more about the life and death of the universe at scale as an attempt to increase understanding of the universe and how it works, hence expanding the circle of knowledge. Now, you may have noticed that despite being the successor of Rupert I, Rupert II's methods were entirely different from his predecessor. I think this is because the real pursuit of the Ruperts wasn't the annihilation of organic life, but the pursuit of the perfect life form. This is why, instead of trying to wipe everything out, Rupert II tried to control life. He tried to refine what already existed, because wiping it out obviously wasn't working. But ultimately, Rupert II must have concluded that this method was also flawed, and if he truly wanted to achieve the perfect life form, he would need to venture beyond his circle of knowledge by creating a new knowledge singularity out of a more complete version of the anti-organic equation. I know that sounds complicated and confusing, but a knowledge singularity is just like a scientific or philosophical concept that redefines our understanding of the world. Think about how Einstein's theory of general relativity changed our understanding of physics. It's kind of like that. That would be considered a knowledge singularity. So Rupert II was attempting to perfect the anti-organic equation to the point where it would redefine our understanding of the world, which would in turn create a knowledge singularity that would expand the universe's circle of knowledge. And theoretically, the creation of this new knowledge singularity would likely wipe out all life as we know it and then redefine what life even is, allowing for a new type of life form to propagate the universe, the perfect life form that both Ruperts desired. And it would also likely push our universe closer to finality. This is why Polka Kakamond targeted Rupert II and killed him. Okay, so rewinding a little bit, sometime either towards the end of or shortly after the Second Machine War, Akavili paid a visit to a planet that had been devastated by repeated cosmic disasters. First the Swarm disaster, and then both machine wars. This planet was called Adlavun, and we don't know much about it apart from the fact that during Akavili's visit, someone from Adlavun ascended to Eonhood and became Nanook. This ascension either marks the start of the Stellaron disaster or simply the moment in which the proliferation of Stellarons within the universe increased dramatically. It really depends on which theory you subscribe to about the real source of Stellarons, since we don't actually know a whole lot about them for sure. Now, elsewhere in the universe, the IPC became very anti-inorganic life, and they seized all of the now defunct Scepters that were left behind by Rupert II. Except for those Doomsday Simulator Scepters. You know, like the one that Amphoreus is apparently built on. Those Scepters were apparently so problematic that most were either sealed away or tossed into cosmic abysses from which they could never be retrieved. Although a couple did manage to slip through the cracks, as we can see by the one Skrullum found, and also Amphoreus. But more on that later. What remained of the Scepter system was then placed under the jurisdiction of the Intelligentsia Guild for research purposes. And while this incredibly powerful computing system promised scholars enormous academic gains in all fields of research, there still remained the question of how to distribute access access to it. Because remember, these scepters were basically planet-sized computers mimicking the functionality of an eon. So even access to a fraction of their computational ability could be groundbreaking in any scientist's research. So obviously, everyone started fighting over access, and it was a horribly chaotic disaster, yes, another one, and it saw countless scientific discoveries made, but then quickly lost or forgotten. There were even a couple of cases of scientists messing around with the alterations to the anti-organic equation, which apparently infected a bunch of other scholars who Polka quickly assassinated, and by the end of it all, 122 scepters had to be destroyed before the scholars could be stopped. Historians later referred to these incidents collectively as the Scholars' Strife, and the history fictionologists had a field day distorting all of the details about it, because of course they did. Towards the end of the Scholars' Strife, an Intelligentsia Guild scholar named Patavia Alder Somerville started receiving a signal once every 13 minutes without interruption or space-time distortion. She made this signal her primary topic of study and determined that it must be some kind of solitary wave of imaginary energy from some indiscernible location deep in space. But due to its persistent and unnaturally pure nature, she theorized that discovering the origin of this solitary wave could reveal the answer to the question of whether or not the universe is predetermined. Or to put it another way, is fate real? She eventually discovers that this solitary wave is actually a recordable phenomenon that one can use to identify one of those unchangeable moments that's calculated by Nous. So she follows the signal, and it leads her to the core of the Scepter system, to Rupert II's Iron Throne. So she sits upon the throne and connects her mind directly to the Scepter system, which immediately resumes its role as a giant cosmic brain extension. And while she could have become Rupert III then and there in that moment, she decided against it and instead tried to peer into the thoughts of Nous. She was unable to comprehend most of what she saw, but she did manage to write down a single formula which would later be known as the solitary waves theory. Herta came across this theory in her youth and solved it, which earned her a glance from Nous and an invitation to the Genius Society. But Herta's solution revealed that we cannot actually know if the universe is predetermined or not because of a constant variable within the solitary waves theory. Basically, the value of this variable determines how stable or unstable the universe is. A high value is high instability and an unpredictable future. A low value is low instability and a predictable future. But this variable oscillates so wildly due to the powers of different paths constantly overriding its value that it's impossible to say what its current state is at any given time. And this reminded me a lot of the circle of knowledge conceptually, because one knowledge singularity variable can completely change the known into the unknown, which in turn makes the future unknowable and unpredictable. So both of them kind of operate on the same logic, right? The more you know or understand, or the more stable your constant variable is, the easier it is to predict an outcome. And the inverse is also true. Now, before we move on to theorizing, I feel obligated to mention that after Rupert II died, Screwlum took over the Intellitron Empire, made a peace deal with the IPC, and for some reason that's never really elaborated on, started investigating Rupert II, which is how he found one of those scepters. I have a feeling that Screwlum might be the focus of one of the future simulated universe expansions, but that's just a theory. It just feels very relevant to the greater universe lore at this point. But okay, that is the end of our history lesson, and now we are free to talk about my thoughts on Amphoreus being a scepter simulation and what it actually means for the story at large. Okay, so there are 3 things we need to consider when it comes to the scepter of Amphoreus. First off, the Doomsday Scepters were all running on the anti-organic equation, which is most likely what we identify as the Black Tide. This was a conclusion that I came to in my 2.7 predictions video, but there is a little bit more to it than I originally thought, and we're gonna get to that. Second, the situation with Amphoreus is a little bit different from the other scepter simulations like the one that Screwlum found, since it also interacts directly with Memoria. As far as we know, the other scepters did not do that. And third, we have to recognize that the Scepter Sims were based on existing civilizations. I want to highlight that last one because I think it could give us a lot of insight into this Lord Ravager that's imprisoned on Amphoreus, and there's been a lot of debate over who this might be. Some people make an argument for Iron Tomb or Selenova, while others like me have pitched the idea that it could be Cyrene or Phynon. Honestly, I can make a good case for all of these, but recently I've been wondering if we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't who the Lord Ravager is, but where they came from. In my predictions video, I submitted the idea that Amphoreus was a destroyed planet from the Laurel Reef Galaxy, seeing as it was heavily damaged by the Machine Wars, and got bonus points for being inspired by ancient Greek and Roman culture and mythology. And that could still very well be the case, but I never pinpointed a planet, and I'm kind of thinking that planet-wise, Amphoreus might actually be based on Adlavun. Yeah, Nanook's home planet. Now I know this seems very silly since Adlavun and Nanook are both named after Inuit mythology and not Greek, but the Greeks had myths about the lands of the Inuit. They called these northern lands Hyperborea, the mythical lands of the north, which would make Amphoreus sort of like what the ancient Greeks would have imagined Hyperborea to be like. So some fact, some fiction, and a lot of that mixin' of the mythology. And I know you might be skeptical about this idea, and I admit I was skeptical too because this idea was actually suggested to me by a friend of mine. But the more I thought about it and the more I looked into it, the more it just made sense. And I hardly know where to start with explaining why all of this makes sense and how many little pieces fit together so nicely, so I'm just gonna start by mentioning that the people of Hyperborea were the favorites of the sun god Apollo, and they were said to be the founders of many of his shrines, especially the ones in Delphi. Coincidentally, the city of Cyrene was named after a princess who founded the city with the assistance of her lover, Apollo. She was also responsible for building many of his temples, and the Cyrene that we have in-game happens to be quite fond of divination methods, just like they were in Delphi. And I will point out that divination falls under the domain of Apollo, so that makes sense. Now, historical accounts appear to be a little fuzzy, but it seems as though the people who settled in the city of Cyrene were trying to escape the hardships of famine and war that were in their hometowns of Thera and Sparta, which means there's no actual evidence whatsoever that the settlers of Cyrene were Inuit or these so-called Hyperboreans, but I want to entertain the idea that in the case of Amphoreus, they could be, or at the very least, Cyrene could have been, because she's technically a mythical entity. She could be from anywhere. But I think Cyrene in particular could be from Hyperborea, or in this case, the original Adlavun, because the name Rubert means glorious shining one, and that bears some similarity to Apollo's role as a solar or light deity. And the name Apollo arguably has its roots in the word Apollon, which means destroyer. And if that's the case, then Cyrene could have been a favorite of Rubert too, as the entity representative of our Hyperborean planet, Adlavun. The same way both Cyrene and the people of Hyperborea were the favorites of Apollo. Now, one of the main reasons I think that Cyrene, at the very least, is from Adlavun is because Cyrene's outfit has some odd similarities to Nanook's. Like, both of them have the exact same bindings on their arms, including the same language. I think it's quite possible that these bindings are part of the traditional dress of Adlavun. Adlavun is also the name of the Inuit afterlife, which is a trait that I think it shares with Amphoreus, since Amphora, which it's named after, were very commonly used in funeral rites. So commonly used that tombstones were often carved in their shape. Add to this the fact that Cyrene is a variant of Elysia from Honkai Impact, who is also named after a realm of the dead, the Elysian Fields, which is also Greek, and the fact that Cyrene's hometown is Idis Elysia, which means temple or tomb of Elysia. Well, this kind of starts to feel a little spooky similar, doesn't it? But this theory doesn't live or die by weak mythological Cyrene ties. Oh no, we're gonna come back to Cyrene, but let's talk about the planet of Adlavun for a minute, because its history may be present in Amphoreus. See, Adlavun had been devastated by 3 cosmic disasters that happened in quick succession. First the Swarm, and then both Machine Wars. If Amphoreus is a simulated copy of Adlavun, then the Black Tide might not be referring to any one disaster, but a compilation of all 3, which would explain why it has the behavior of making things go mad like the anti-organic equation from the Machine Wars, but also has some similarities to how the Swarm is described, because, you know, they're both described as dark tides that consume everything in their path. And this idea of the Black Tide actually being an amalgamation of multiple disasters is supported by the existence of this inexplicable image from the Swarm Disaster Simulated Universe expansion. In it is this guy who looks weirdly similar to Phynon holding a ticket to the Astral Express with bandages around his arms and a devastated desert world in the background, an endless sea of golden sands. This image is never explained or acknowledged, it just kind of shows up, but If you ask me, I think this person may have been Nanook pre-Ascension, because remember, Akavili visited the devastated Adlavun just prior to the Ascension, so it's possible that these two met and Akavili gave the pre-ascended Nanook a ticket to the Express. And if this is the case, then it's possible, nay, likely, that Amphoreus is indeed a doomsday simulation of Adlavun, wherein Rupert II was trying to ascertain the exact conditions that led to the ascension of an Eon, which means that Cyrene would have been someone overseeing this system, perhaps a digital recreation of someone young Nanook once knew. In fact, the town of Idis Elysia could actually be an attempt at recreating a sort of Adlavun-ish like place on a smaller scale pre-destruction. And similar to what happened with Nanook and Adlavun, the destruction of Idis Elysia would act as a trigger for Phinon's descent towards the path of destruction. But this would also mean that Phinon isn't just similar to Nanook, he's an actual simulation of pre-ascension Nanook. And if that's the case, then a ton of stuff starts to make sense, like the golden blood thing, and the weird thing where the parallels keep getting drawn between Phinon and the Trailblazer. The Trailblazer is supposed to represent Akavili's arrival on Adlavun. The interaction between this pre-ascension Nanook and the Trailblazer might be alluding to a fact that there was a potential future wherein Nanook got on the Astral Express and never became an Eon, which could also be why Phinon's halo in his splash art, which is also the symbol of Kefili, looks eerily similar to the symbol of the Trailblaze, and the same goes for the Trailblaze power icon and Phinon's bracer, as my friend Crystal pointed out to me. Now here's the thing, both Rupert I and Rupert II were seekers of perfection. The reason they wanted to obliterate organic life initially was because it was imperfect. Similarly, the reason why Rupert II attempted to expand his cognition was because he wanted to create a new knowledge singularity using the anti-organic equation as a means to change the definition of life itself. We already kind of talked about this, but I wanted to mention it again because if he was pursuing an altogether different type of existence, then I think that pursuit is represented by Anaxa's theories of alchemy. TLDR on that, if you didn't know what this whole alchemy thing was about, alchemy is essentially defined by Anaxa as merely a means by which one can manipulate memoria. And since their entire simulated world is made up of memoria, it's kind of like mucking about with the world's source code. And on a related note, the historical goal of alchemy was always to pursue perfection and gold. And if we think of Amphoreus as a giant alchemical amphora-shaped crucible, then the memories within it are simply being refined over time in an effort to produce gold, specifically Chrysos heirs, those of golden blood. And among those Chrysos heir is one perfect heir, specifically Phinon, who is also most likely a burgeoning young Lord Ravager, as is fitting for a simulated recreation of Nanook. Now, I have a sense that Cyrene is a bit like her Honkai Impact counterpart in that her ultimate goal was originally supposed to be a recreation of a destructive force, but I think she grew quite fond of humanity in her pursuit over time and wanted to find a means by which they could change their inevitable fate of destruction. But that would require Phinon taking a path that differed from the one Nanook walked. This suggests that currently the simulation of Amphoreus can only end in one way. It can only end with Phinon becoming the Flame Reaver and also a destroyer. But I think it's Cyrene's goal to keep Phinon as Phinon, to have him actually take on the role of creator instead. So basically, I think that Cyrene was trying to find ways in which she could tamper with the simulation in order to achieve a different outcome. So she was trying to change the script in ways that could appeal to the heir of Kefali's humanity and prevent them from embracing destruction. But this isn't possible in a closed system. You remember our talk about expanding the circle of knowledge and trying to ascertain whether or not the universe is really predetermined? Well, a simulation has a much smaller scale than a universe, which means that there are less variables to consider. So I do think that Cyrene must be able to calculate probable outcomes with incredible accuracy, something that I think is represented by her tarot cards, her divination, right? And if she can calculate the future, then she probably knows that no matter what she changes within the system, Phinon will always choose to destroy Amphoreus and reset the simulation. But if your circle of knowledge does not contain the ingredients for the outcome you want, want, you're gonna need to reach into the unknowable domain to find new variables and thus bring them into your circle. Those unknown variables unlock new future potentials. And I think those unknown variables are March, because I now think that March is a fragment of Cyrene or a memo sprite that's made with the power of Mythos rather than Fuli. Mythos is, after all, the eon that governs over the unknowable and the one who seeks to challenge the certainty of nous. If any eon was suited for introducing unexpected variables into equations, it would be them. Plus, the realm of fiction is Mythos's domain, and if we think of Amphoreus as a literal myth, then it is a world of fiction, at least as far as the outside world is concerned. But to the people of Amphoreus, this fiction is their reality, and it's the outside world that's relegated to the realm of fiction. Now, if you were attempting to make something fictional into reality, which is what I think the real miracle of Genesis will do, then you will need to make like Mythos and weave fiction into facts. So what I'm basically saying is that I think Cyrene created a fictional version of herself in order to explore the fictional world outside of Amphoreus, and that's why March would be a construct of the Enigmata and not of the Remembrance. March is in existence somewhat like Gallagher's dormancy. I do think we should consider exploring the similarities between Cyrene and Gallagher at a later date, like once we've spent a little more time with Cyrene. Because I'm very intrigued at the possibility that both of them are, or at least likely are, affiliated with the Enigmata. But also, they're both named after locations. Cyrene after a city, and Gallagher, well, apparently his full name is straight up Penacony. This is likely because his virtual character of Gallagher was made by mixing 52 or more Penaconians together. Now, in some ways, we could think of him as like a manifestation of the will of the people of Penacony as imagined by a history fictionologist, which would totally line up with this hypothesis of Cyrene potentially being a representative of all of the people of Adlavun. And Gallagher created dormancy, also known as death, in order to exploit a loophole within the golden dream. Because you can't die within a dream, but you also can't fall asleep within a dream. I think Cyrene created March for a very similar purpose, to exploit a loophole. See, by virtue of being part of a simulation running on the anti-organic equation, Cyrene likely had traces of that virus in her system. So technically speaking, any clone or fragment based on her, or anything about Amphoreus, would likely have the anti-organic equation virus too. Unless that clone or fragment lacked all of their memories. Because remember, the only way to rid someone of the anti-organic equation is to wipe their memories of it. And I think that's why March was a blank slate when the Astral Express found her floating in space. And this would also explain why March's 6-phase ice is so akin to dream weaving. Dreams are not the domain of Fuli, they're the domain of Mythos. March walks the path of the Enigmata and doesn't even know it. That's how good her fiction is. Now, I think the initial intention of Cyrene for the fictional March was to have March travel the cosmos collecting memories and stories with her camera, with the hope that one day her journey would lead her back to where it started. Back to Amphoreus. Should a day ever come, and it did, then I think Cyrene's plan was to hijack March's memories and incorporate those stories of the real world into the story of the fictional Amphoreus. And I think this part of the process resulted in March entering Amphoreus as Mem, and since her memories had been seized, she may have even forgotten who she was and reverted to a less stable form? They do call her a mythical beast, after all. And as someone from the real world, when placed into a fictional world, she would take on a more fictional form, right? But even as Mem, March's directives were the same. She was to record memories of her journey in Amphoreus. And once the story of Amphoreus was complete in the book, as I've written, she would be able to take it to the outside world with her. And since the story of Amphoreus is now in the real world, and the story of the real world is now in Amphoreus, she will have created a point where fact and fiction overlap, which would allow both worlds to converge, thus allowing Amphoreus to witness an actual genesis, the birth of a new planet. But all of this is dependent on Phynon becoming the hero of this story and not the villain this time. In this story, he cannot become Nanook or the cycle is going to reset once again. And for all of this to happen, for Phynon to become the hero, I think Phynon requires hope for the future. And Cyrene has been doing all she can to create the perfect conditions for that hope to take root. And I just want to point out that this was also the motivation for her Honkai Impact namesake. Alicia ended up sacrificing herself in order to provide the future with a sense of hope for a new possibility. Which is, funnily enough, more or less the same thing Gallagher was trying to do in Penacony. That feeling of hope after a long period of despair on a prison planet was kept alive through the story of Clocky and friends. So that story of the Watchmaker and the Nameless and all of the prisoners on Penacony trying to break free, that's the story of Clocky and friends. That is a story of hope and perseverance. And if I'm anywhere close to right about this, then there are not 3, but 4 paths in Amphoreus. And 3 of those paths, Erudition, Remembrance, and Enigmata, are tying down the 4th path of Destruction. Destruction is fettered to the planet, and the other 3 paths are the fetters. So all of this boils down to one simple idea, that Amphoreus is just a recreation of the story of Nanook's ascension in Adlavun, and Cyrene is trying to change this unchangeable moment of ascension that marks the end of the story. Oh, and if Screwloom's comment about the butterfly flapping its wings is any indication, then it's very possible that this undertaking, this miracle of Genesis, this process of making the unreal into something real, well, it might draw the attention of Miss Polka Kakamond and her trusty scalpel. I really thought about ending the video there. I really did. But you know what? I can't. I just can't. Because I need to talk about Gallagher, Cyrene, Fuli, and Mythos. So forgive my crash out, it is absolutely tinfoil hat time. Okay, so since Amphoreus dropped, I've been wondering about the relationship between Mythos and Fuli, because the more I think about it, the more it doesn't really make sense to me. They say that Fuli is collecting memories in order to rebuild the universe after it inevitably ends, but aren't memories like the worst material to rebuild a universe from? Like if I wanted to recreate something, I would want more concrete records to work with. Objective historical accounts, personal biographics, blueprints, that kind of thing. Memories are like some of the most fallible pieces of data that we have. Like think about this. They're not stored in a linear manner, meaning they don't respect our perception of time. They can easily be manipulated, fabricated, embellished, diminished, or forgotten. So why choose memoria and memories as a basis for recreating the universe? You're gonna end up with something extremely imprecise. Like whatever you end up with will be similar to what you had before, but never quite the same. And yet, on a much smaller scale, this is the role of Kefali within Amphoreus, right? Kefali's job is to recreate the world from their memories during the miracle of Genesis, which might be why both Kefali and Fuli are called Skyfather in Amphoreus. They're both recreating the world or the universe from memories. But when Kefali does this, a lot of things change from the previous cycle. It's not a straight up reset the world kind of deal, it's more of a revise and rewind the world kind of deal. And it is fascinating to me that Mythos' followers are responsible for the preservation of memories through the manipulation of them. Like the tale of the Watchmaker is immortalized through Clocky, right? And people will forget Mikhail, but they will never forget Clocky. So in a lot of ways, the path of Enigmata also preserves memories, just in an unrecognizable form, but the same ideas get across. Lality's Lore made a really fun video as I was finishing up some edits on this one about Fuli potentially being a fabrication of Mythos, which I think is a really, really fun idea, especially because it was something I was kind of entertaining very lightly a few days prior to writing this whole script. So I definitely recommend checking out that video. I'll leave a link for you. But I am still a little bit conflicted on how that would work mechanically. Like, is Fuli something like a glass bottle that holds Mythos's ink-like form that it writes all its fiction with? Or is it alternatively that Mythos is Fuli's Eon-grade memo sprite? I mean, one of the 3-star Remembrance light cones is a bunch of jellyfish, which is Mythos' signature. It feels like a very odd choice for a Remembrance light cone. And I've always thought of memo keepers as something like the historians of the world, the absolute record keepers of everything that's ever happened in the universe. But the Remembrance path is also home to the cremators, who destroy memories. And then sometimes you get memo keepers like Rekka, who's like a filmographer. And not even of the documentary variety, he's someone who wants to manipulate the silver screen, which really feels like it belongs more to Enigmata than Remembrance. And it also makes it feel like Remembrance isn't the path of the record keeper, but of the librarian. And a library is going to host books of all sorts. Fact, fiction, doesn't really matter. Any kind of recorded content goes in the collection. They're curators, whereas the followers of Mythos tend to be a bit more like artists. They're directly interfering with the worlds, they're manipulating them, they're editing them. They're involved with creating all of these interesting things that the memo keepers can collect. And if they don't want to collect them, they cull them, hence the cremators. Is that really enough to differentiate between these two paths? I don't know. Does it bother me? Absolutely. And you know what else bothers me? Gallagher. And how his role in trying to preserve Penacony's history and carry out the legacy of the Watchmaker is so similar to what I think's happening with Cyrene in Amphoreus. And remember, Penacony was a dream world. It's made of Memoria, which should be under Fuli's jurisdiction, but twisting Memoria into dreams is what Mythos does best. And it's also rumored that Mythos made the crack that leaked out all the Memoria in the first place, which means Mythos had a huge part to play in the creation of Penacony. Now, Amphoreus is also a world made out of Memoria, right? But it's also like a fictional world that keeps getting rewritten. It's not too dissimilar to a dream world when you think about it. Penacony even had like a Samsara time loop thing that Sunday did, just like Amphoreus has the resetting cycles. That's likely why Welt compared what Sunday was doing on Penacony to what Kevin did in Honkai Impact 3rd, which should be very similar to what Finon does as Kefali, because Finon is a variant of Kevin. Oh, this whole universe is so confusing. But anyway, it's not these time loops and weird dudes making very strange decisions about recreating the world all the time and being made out of Memoria that these two worlds have in common. Let's take another look at Gallagher, because he's a follower of the Enigmata, right? Now, the virtual character that is Gallagher is also a bartender that serves up dream-woven drinks, mostly featuring Soulglad, which is a golden dream soda that alters your emotional state kind of like alcohol does. And it's described as tasting of divine nectar, which reminded me of the golden wine that Aglaya gave us that was made out of Titan blood, the dew of divine blood. And the soul part of Soulglad reminds me of Anax's soul alchemy, which is really just Memoria manipulation. And souls appear gold, while Memoria and memory traces are blue or violet, meaning there has to be a difference between the raw Memoria and a soul that's made of Memoria. But this got me thinking about Eucharistic stuff, you know, like drinking wine as if it were the blood of Christ, or some other holy entity. This ritual is based on the notion that one's soul is in their blood. It's a belief found in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah. And this link between soul and blood and wine is actually thought to have its roots in Grecian ritual meal practices due to similarities and close cultural proximities between Jewish people and Grecians. Although that's not a definite, but it is certainly a strong enough connection for our purposes, especially since Chrysos heirs are holy children of gods, titans rather, with golden blood that can be equated to wine. And yes, I know this is a very silly comparison to make, but the reason I mention it is because of this concept of blood wine. Remember when Fuli appeared to deliver the prophecy of finality and Noose's 3 unchangeable moments during Louis Fleming's retirement speech? Well, the other thing that Fuli brought with them was a riddle from the Enigmata, which was centered around the words blood and flower. And I think blood and flower are how Mythos intends to change the unchangeable moments. Is there really a connection between the dew of the divine blood and Soulglad in this context? I don't really know, but just hear me out for a second. 2 of the 3 unchangeable moments were about Rupert, and we now know that Amphoreus is a planet made out of Rupert II's attempts at recreating Noose's cosmic brain, and it's full of people with golden blood who are trying to thwart fate. That should be an unchangeable moment, at least within the context of Amphoreus. That should be the blood part of the riddle. And yes, I was suggesting that Gallagher was kind of foreshadowing this, especially because of the flower portion of the riddle. Because again, back in Penacony, Gallagher created the mimetic entity known as Death. Then later he claimed he was 13 years old, and a lot of people think that this number 13 is a reference to the number 13 in the tarot deck, which is the Death card. In the Rider-Waite deck specifically, which is like the tarot default deck, Death carries a black banner with a white rose on it. White roses mean immortality and rebirth, and this specific rose is a reference to the War of Roses, a real battle for the crown of England in the 15th century. It symbolized peace and rebuilding after a lot of bloodshed and war, hence the rebirth meaning, which applies to Gallagher, because when the original history fictionologist Self killed off the virtual character of Gallagher, he left behind a note and this drawing that Misha made, which contains a bizarre entity here clothed in black with a mirror for a head holding a bouquet of white roses. Now, Cyrene uses tarot cards for her divination, and the card for Finon should equate to the sun since he's the Dawnbringer and heralds a new day. Now, the Death card and the Sun card are linked via the horse on them in the Rider-Waite deck, because it is the same horse and it's supposed to symbolize the cycle of death and rebirth. Well, hello there, Deathly Flame Reaver and Dawnbringer Finon. I'm upset with both of you and the horse you rode in on. Phainon. Now, these two work really well with the idea of death and rebirth, and thus the white roses, but they don't really have a connection to the flower themselves. But assuming Cyrene is a follower of the Enigmata, or at least is leveraging the Enigmata's power in some capacity, the way that Gallagher does, and that she is somehow related to March, then we will have a direct connection to roses once again, because March is known in Amphoreus as the Rosy Celestial Maiden. And since I made the argument earlier that March might be Mem, a mythical version of herself in Amphoreus, then March really could be the second part of Methus's riddle. She's a rose, a flower, the complement to the golden blood of Phainon. And if both the conditions of golden blood and rose flower are fulfilled, then that means that this could be the means by which Noos's unchangeable moments become changeable once again. I could be totally off base though. I could have had this crash out for no reason. But you know what? My original pre-release hypothesis of Amphoreus being connected to Rupert was one heck of a long shot when I made it, and it turned out to be right. So here's my second long shot. Let's see how this pans out. If you're still with me, then thank you so much for watching. You're finally free. You can leave now. And to all my lovely channel members that are floating by the screen right now like tiny little butterflies of their own, you're awesome. Thank you so much for your support and your enabling of my nonsense. I appreciate every single one of you. Now I am off to theorize some more. So take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.